Hello, everyone. Um, this is the third of a series of interviews with Miki Kashtan as a response to COVID-19 crisis, conducted in parallel to her blog post articles. I'd like to start with my question. So, Miki, in your article, as a response to the pandemic, you are looking at our interconnectedness with life and with each other as an innate part of what it means to be human. And as an extension of it, you bring two human experiences, solidarity and separation. In the way I interpret them, that we experience solidarity in occasional times. And when it's there, no matter how rare it happens, we recognize it, we know it, and its power, internally and externally. After a while, though, in most cases, it slips away from our consciousness. Whereas in the separation, it's always there, yet it's almost impossible to see it. Even maybe now, some people, some of the listeners are not quite fully getting what this separation is. So it's like fish cannot see the ocean while swimming in the ocean. And I believe that our ability to build and sustain solidarity is very much connected to our ability to fully grasp separation. So two things help me to understand separation. One is to learn its historic roots embedded into our social evolution. And second is how it manifests itself in our very daily life. So you touch on both in your article, and can you elaborate them a bit more for us?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say that it feels tragic to me that solidarity is the exception and separation is the norm. That separation is what we experience most of the time. First of all, I think that is not true around the world in similar manner. I'm looking at Rena, and I know that for Rena and for many people in the global South, solidarity is much more vivid still than it is in places in the global North. And I'm thinking about where you're from, Turkey, is kind of like with one foot here and one foot there. And so I don't know much about Turkey. I'm just intuiting that is so. So there are two thoughts that come to mind, and I'm just going to follow my intuition about them. One is that the notion of self that we have is a notion of separation. Fundamentally, self, in the way that we've learned it, is what isn't other. There's a line, there's a boundary. So we define self by what it isn't. We define a nation by it's different from all the other nations. So identity, selfhood, is based on separation, but it doesn't have to be. I'm reminded of a conversation that I had with a person from India who's part of a family business that has a business in India and a business in the US. And we were talking about, I was consulting with that company, and we were talking about something that brought the two sides of the family in tension. And I said, Miki, I have to give you some context so you can understand this tension. He said, it has everything to do with two philosophies of marketing. The philosophy of marketing in the US is you market yourself through your uniqueness, how what you're doing is different from what other people are doing. He says, that's not what we do in India. In India, we market ourselves by just saying what we're doing. This is who I am. This is our business. This is what we sell. This is what we love about our product. This is what people love about our product, but without comparison to others. The moment you start comparing, it's based on separation. So in the last several months, I came to have a visceral sense that it's possible to have a sense of self that isn't based on separation. that is based on being, on the flow of being, of expression of who I am, without having to differentiate myself from who others are. And I know it's on the edge of consciousness, but it is possible. And when we are able to do that, then we don't experience separation. I'm wondering if it even, I see that Rina is nodding, I see Yaron is nodding, and I'm curious, Özge, if it touches anything, if it resonates anywhere.
This place definitely touches somewhere. You know, when I call self, yes, this does bring a separation with whatever this self is, self and the others. And at the same time, yes, there is this border, there is this line of me. So of course it's this question, okay, where do I end? Where do the rest start? Or is it all one?
So now I'm thinking, a lot of people still don't know that there are more cells inside your body that aren't you than that are you. Literally, the number of microbes that exist in our gut is more than the number of cells that we have that are our own body. But are they really not self? Or is there an interconnection right there inside ourselves that calls into question the whole idea that self is defined by border rather than defined by flow and expression? So I'm going to leave it here because I don't think we can go very far into that. But that goes in everything that underpins Western civilization is based on self and other, on binaries that are very rigidly defined. They often relate to, so dualities don't have to be hierarchical, but all the dualities that come from Western civilization are. There's always a duality with one thing that is better than the other. And that is embedded in most places. It's, you know, the global north, the Western civilization is penetrating everything. So there's also class variables. It's very complicated. A lot of the middle and upper classes in many global south countries are actually westernized and are oriented, get their cues from the global north rather than from their own culture. So there's a kind of homogenization that is different from solidarity. It's like the erasure of self rather than an affirmation of self that is rooted in flow. These are things that are very hard to talk about, that I'm not even sure I'm putting words to it, that my words are actually carrying the meaning that I want to give it. But what is clear to me is that the path of separation is a path of destruction, because separation on the edge of it, and sometimes very close in, is framing other as threat to self. There's a segment, a very interesting piece of one of Sigmund Freud's last books, where he talks about, he quotes from a letter that he received from another person, talking about the oceanic feeling, which I think we don't know that word maybe, but it's very clear the oceanic feeling is that feeling of oneness. And the way that he responds to it, when I was reading it, I said to myself, Sigmund Freud never escaped self, never escaped separation, because he called oceanic feeling regression to pre-differentiation, meaning differentiation is natural development. That is taking his cultural context and affirming it as forever, which is one of the core errors that Western civilization does. It doesn't recognize itself to be a local culture. It always thinks of itself as a universal culture, and then everything else is judged against it and is less. So the experience of oneness without losing self is not one that we are familiar with. And I have a sense that this virus is inviting us to look at it and go, wait a minute, we are one. We are one. We need to be one. And it shows us that we are one because it knows no borders, doesn't respect class. I mean, sure, there are 2 to 7 times more African American people who die of the virus in the US than white people, but that's not because the virus has a predisposition to attack people from with darker skins. Obviously not. It's because there are better or worse protections that people can put on themselves or each other. So it's actually an absence of solidarity, not a property of the virus. The virus knows no borders, no definitions, has no respect for all our structures. It just will go where it can go, which is what life does. So I don't know how well I've answered your question because it took me far afield, but if you have a follow-up, I will be happy to respond.
The historic roots of this separation embedded into our social evolution, it every time I listen to it from you, it completes the picture with a huge piece for me. So I was just wishing everyone to hear this.
Sure, I'm happy to say it. I think I was just today working on taking my long patriarchy article and shrinking it to less than half its size because it is going to be republished in some other place and they wanted it shorter, no footnotes, just, the narrative of it. So I've been working on exactly this. So it's very hard for us to grasp that things could have been other than what they are now. This is a general feature. It's like, for example, children who grow up in abusive families, don't think of them as abusive families. It's just, this is my family. You become an adult before you realize, oh, that was abusive. I didn't know. And so to imagine a pre-patriarchal society for most of us is really difficult unless we do significant work to open ourselves to imagination. And luckily there are scholars who have dug up a lot of artifacts and mythologies and very, very complex research that they've done that seems to point to there having been most of our existence as a species, peaceful coexistence between humans and each other and between humans and planet Earth. And for that coexistence to occur means a reciprocal relationship, a relationship of mutual care. It's the solidarity. So, for example, I read in this book that I absolutely love, Braiding Sweetgrass, that when the white settlers came to North America, they were making fun of the local people for harvesting only half of the grain that they planted. They worked hard for however many days, harvested half of the field, and let the other half there to keep it going and fluid, because they're, over many, many centuries, they've come to believe that through experience, that if you harvest less than half, that's the optimal. It turns out that if you harvest even less than that, then you leave the field with too much competition for resources within what stays. So it's like it really is optimal, is about half, and then it regenerates. That's a relationship in which you care for the plants that feed you, and you have a sense that there's mutual care, that the plants are caring for you, which is a notion that sounds absurd to a Western mind, that plants could care. And I'm just going to leave it at a question. Why not? Why assume that plants don't care only because we think of them as other? So that's what appears to have existed. For a long time, I believed that agriculture was the culprit. But I no longer believe that based on the things that I've read, because in many places, there was agriculture that was in balance with the rest of life. It's when you go into crops, into growing things for accumulation, for storage, rather than for flow, that you go outside of the balanced flow of the natural abundance that exists. So how did that come about? We actually don't know. Nobody actually has an answer. They're only conjectures. But the one that makes sense to me is that it happened in different ways in different parts of the world, but follows a kind of similar pattern of traumatic, overwhelming experiences that outstrip a society's capacity to metabolize the difficulty, and therefore sort of activate almost like a collective fight, flight, freeze trauma response. And if you think about it, when you're under trauma, you separate. The scarcity that trauma brings means you have to now care for self, whether self is individual or self is family or self is clan or self is collective. You have to care for self before other things because it's a survival threat. And then what ended up happening is the trauma gets carried on from generation to generation, also gets exported through invasion. I'm not going to get into all the details. And with that, you are in permanent danger. And if you're in permanent danger, you're in permanent separation. And if you're in permanent separation, you lose your power, because human power comes from togetherness. So that's the sense that I have of how it came to be. And then it reinforces itself intergenerationally.
From what we've heard so far, it sounds like what you've written, that what we need is some truly foundational changes to our entire outlook on life in order to survive, basically. And just hearing you say that this was a challenge, or that Sigmund Freud didn't actually achieve this, that it was hard for him to even see the social context and to differentiate that from our what I think you're saying is our nature. I'm just wondering, to take on this such a big task, what are some ways that we can get ourselves going to kind of bootstrap this and navigate this what I think would be a journey, perhaps a lifelong journey? And yeah, go ahead.
Are you talking individually or collectively?
I guess thinking about it now individually, but I'd love to hear thoughts on collectively as well. I imagine we need support.
Let's start with the individual. I think if you're just starting the journey, the first thing that you could do is what Oskar was talking about before, is begin to notice where thoughts of separation appear. Because if you don't see them at all, you don't recognize choice. If you're always immersed in separation, then it doesn't even seem like you're choosing separation, because it's just a groove. So being able to recognize where I'm doing separation is a beginning. So, some clues I already mentioned. If you compare yourself, you're in separation. Do you do comparison?
Oh yeah.
Do you recognize the feeling of it as separation?
Not always explicitly.
So you can begin there. when you feel anxious, you're in separation. It's a different kind of separation. You're in separation from your present moment experience. You're focused on a future that you can't know. Anxiety is never about the present. Tension can be in the present, but anxiety is future focused. You see that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
So, a practice that I sometimes take on, and it's very telling for me that I forget that I have it as a practice. The practice is whenever I see myself as even slightly different from another person, to think of 3 things that we have in common, to antidote the habit of seeing how we're different. This is a very deep habit of mine. I've always experienced myself as different from everyone, different within my family, different within my school, different at my work, different, you name it, always different. But I learned over the years that I'm also not alone. My sister once was at a workshop and, led a small group of about 20 people. The workshop was very big. So they were in a circle and she said, okay, how many of you have ever felt like an outsider? Everybody raised their hand and she said, no. You don't understand. I don't mean just like run-of-the-mill outsider. Like you utterly know that you are completely different from everyone else. Everybody raised their hand. So it was a kind of a funny moment that stayed with me. If you think about it, I'm very curious to know what will happen in the generations that come, because I don't know which generation you're in and how much those habits are still there. What is the first thing that happens when a baby is born in a hospital? The first thing. It's a cut.
Okay. I was going to say it cries. I don't know.
You cut the umbilical cord. That is a fundamental mistrust of nature. The design of human beings didn't come with a pair of scissors. There is a function to the umbilical cord that I would imagine is both physiological and emotional. The shock of leaving a place where you didn't have to do anything whatsoever to have your needs met, and suddenly you're out there, it's a huge shock. I can see that the umbilical cord serves to soften that shock, to prevent it from being traumatic. There's still nutrients that pass, there's still something that passes, and you are tied. You're supposed to be held in arms 24/7, not necessarily by one person, but by someone 24/7. How many of us got that? We emerge into the world into a lesson in separation. So the practice of solidarity is to watch where you separate and to consciously bring your awareness to moving towards. You read in the paper about someone suffering. There's some way that we distance ourselves from it. It's like, okay, it's happening to someone else, not to me. Phew, what a relief. Instead, you can move towards that experience, to imagine that happening to you. It's not going to change the experience of the other person. This is a practice for yourself. Once you begin to rebuild that muscle of solidarity, then you can start thinking about action. Because if you do action in solidarity that isn't rooted in an actual experience of solidarity, it has some flavor of a spiritual bypass. You're skipping something within yourself. And this is, I don't know how many of you have heard of the phenomenon of white savior. You know about it, Zinovia? It's like when white people take it upon themselves to do something for the vulnerable people, the miserable people, the suffering people of the world. But if you do it without recognizing yourself in them, there's a superiority in it and a separation. So being able to really feel the continuity, this person sitting here, this person in the picture, they are me and I am them. Your action will be different. So that's what I can say on the individual. And I'm curious if that speaks to you.
Yeah, it does. Part of what I was thinking was that it might be tempting to kind of dismiss this as like new age, we're all one, let's all hold hands kind of thing. And what I'm hearing is that it actually takes time and intention to stop and think and reflect, okay, how am I differentiating myself, and what would it actually be like to put myself in a situation and context?
Yeah, and I mentioned in the article this statement from my friend Victor Lewis, we're all on the same boat. We're all in the same boat, not on the same deck. So, for example, in terms of global warming, we already have hundreds of millions of affected people, but it's not yet affected the global north, so it's still other. In terms of the pandemic, people with less access to resources are more affected than people with more access to resources for a variety of reasons. And that means that even as we're thinking, some people think first. So solidarity is about crossing that line, not standing behind the fence that can help you protect yourself while others are drowning. So it is an intense practice. It's not just fancy words. Yeah, thank you.
Synovio also had the question about the collective,
right.
which you did answer, but maybe I could formulate it in a certain way, which is like what we've seen during the crisis is that nations have withdrawn back into their own onto their own borders in a way. They've closed down borders, and even within Europe, where supposedly there are no borders anymore, suddenly new borders, or the old borders reappeared, and the old nation states became very much themselves in terms of looking after themselves, etc. So even within Europe, which is the one political entity that I'm familiar with, that has supposedly at least created a lot of flows between the nations. Even at that time of crisis, things really shrunk back into each country. And then there is, of course, the big question, which is being asked right now, as the crisis, the virus is still spreading big time in the world, particularly in Latin America just now. So in Europe, it's getting better, but in other parts of the world, it's getting worse. That the peak is not reached yet, and the question is, the question has been asked at a like the high political level: how can Europe and other richer countries be in solidarity with countries that are of less economic resilience in the world? And when there's going to be a massive economic recession anyway, there's this question around solidarity in times of crisis collectively is really quite a big deal. So my question is, what are the systems that we need to put in place, that we need to really get ourselves into building worldwide, as well as in our own collectives, that will allow to build a culture of solidarity when at an individual level we still have so much trauma to heal before we can be in that place of oneness that you were describing.
Yeah. So I want to, in response, I want to look at one country in the world that hasn't gotten much attention that I mentioned in the article, which is Vietnam. And the reason why Vietnam is so interesting is that it's a very poor country relative to many other places. And it has done And it has a long border with China, where the pandemic started. So you would think that they would be heavily affected, but it's one of the countries in the world that has been least affected. They've had less than 350 cases and not a single dead person. And when you look at what they did, I think that there is the beginnings of an answer there. They did not create any separation, except they did separate themselves from everywhere else in the world, which is understandable considering that the capacity in most of the world to respond to the pandemic based on need, on assessment of need, has been absolutely abysmal. Abysmal. I think abysmal is not a strong enough word. So they recognized that they need to protect themselves, which makes sense in a time of danger. But within, they called on collective solidarity, which is apparently very strong there. I'm not trying to make it into a heaven. I am quite confident that a big part of the solidarity is coerced. But there's only so much that you can coerce people, as we well know, because people are longing for freedom, will find a way to uncoerce ourselves if coercion is the only means. And so part of what they did, they never had a full lockdown anywhere, but they had selective lockdowns in places. As soon as there were, like a couple of cases somewhere, they had selective lockdowns that were completely released after 20 days of no new case in a particular zone. And those were roving. They traced, they did intelligent measures based on information and on need. So they prioritized the well-being of the whole. That is the essential aspect of solidarity that they did. In many other places, it's almost like I think about it a lot. I don't understand. I almost understand, but then I don't understand why full lockdown would be more tolerable to people in the global north than having every person have their temperature checked when they go into a public place. There's something that feels absurd about it. But I can also see that somehow having my temperature checked could feel invasive if I'm not connected to what it serves. And since we're so disconnected, because that's how they did in places, because they also didn't have tests. So temperature check in many parts of Asia that knew how to deal with pandemics because they already dealt with the SARS pandemic. I don't remember exactly how long ago, about 15 years ago. They found surrogate measures that did well enough so that an individual who anyone had any reason to believe was carrying the disease was isolated and dealt with, rather than an entire population unselectively. So there is a willingness to take on personal discomfort for the benefit of the whole that we've lost. We've just lost it. So that is the absurdity. I don't believe that lockdown is such a great measure. The cost of lockdown is immense, and it affects primarily elderly people, people who suffer from depression, and people whose jobs make it impossible for them to work from home. So all of these are vulnerable populations, and they are the ones most affected directly by lockdowns. Those of us who can work on Zoom, we are, it's kind of like it's unpleasant. Maybe. For some of us, it's not even unpleasant. Many people experience it as a relief, but there are people who are deeply affected by it. In solidarity, in a public policy that is based on need and solidarity, you would consider what is the most direct pathway to protecting as many people as possible with the least amount of impact on the whole by the willingness of individuals to undergo more strict measures individually if that serves the good of the whole. We don't know how to do that anymore in the rich countries, so to speak. And I'm thinking about your question because I don't know many details about what is happening in Latin America. I think only some of it has to do with lack of access to resources. I think a lot of it has to do with being so completely devastated at global imperialism that they don't have infrastructure of communication, of capacity to mobilize resources, even if they're there. I'm not even confident that if resources were sent there, anybody would have the capacity to utilize them well. I really don't know. I would need to study it, and I want to take this question with me. I keep coming back to Cuba. Doctors from Cuba came to Italy to help. Doctors from Cuba are all over the world helping in places where no one else wants to go. So what does solidarity mean when you are just at home and just you push a button and that button means I'm in solidarity? I'm not confident of that. I think our imagination is lacking in terms of what actual mobilization would mean. And I'm including myself in it. I don't see the pathway, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means it's beyond my current imagination. I'm curious if you have any further thoughts.
I think it's a culture we need to build worldwide. We're not there. It's been, as you say, it's been at some level it's been destroyed. At another level, I believe it's never existed. To be struck by a virus, the whole world being affected by that is not exactly something that we've had to deal very often in our human history. So there's something about the whole world. So to be able to build, we don't even have the governance systems worldwide level that would enable even for that culture to be built, to start being built in the first place.
Yeah.
So that's where we need to start. How do we build a worldwide governance model that is based on solidarity and needs before we can even build systems that would allow to respond to a crisis like that. In the way you're describing. So we're far from it yet.
Yes, and this is why I think Europe is retreating to nation states at this time, because even within Europe, the structures of the European Union are primarily to support neoliberalism. They're not primarily to support people. And so the nation state is an entity that has the capacity to close its borders and therefore have some illusion that within we can do something to protect. And if you look around Europe, different countries did different things, and some of them were more or less successful. So I can understand, considering the very loose attitude in Italy initially, that people would become nervous in other countries if they think that that is not a good response. And that is the unit that has most recently been the one for 200-300 years that has been the entity to make decisions that affect the many. And we don't have, the UN is a joke. It's not really something that supports people. There is no mechanism existing in the world that is designed to support people. That is something that just to let these words reverberate might be a little next step that we can take right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, I was touched by your comment that doing something for someone without seeing yourself in them is difficult, and that comes from this whole idea of separation, which also means hierarchy in some sense, that comparison and stuff like that. And I really see that part of India here also. We are aping the West. And it's you know, it shows up as loss of dignity for people for whom we show up. And my question is that, you know, in India there is this understanding, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the whole world, you know, is a family, my family. So in that sense, there is overwhelm. So on one part of the world, there is separation, and at the other, there is overwhelm, which keeps us from doing something, you know. So how do I, and the antidote to that is self-connection, you know, so that there is some sense of calmness and coming back to your breath. Just that, vipassana, just coming back to your breath. But how do we sustain our self-connection and resonance at the same time? And how do we do that in a world or the society which is inherently functioning from interdependence? And how do we do that in a society where there is inherent independence?
A lot that you're asking. The first thing that comes to mind is a practice, I think it comes from Tibetan Buddhism, a practice of Tonglen. Are you familiar with Tonglen?
Yes.
Tonglen is a practice, I'm not super familiar with it, but it's a practice of, on the in-breath, you focus on your own suffering. And on the out-breath, you focus on the suffering of all the other people in the world who have the same experience as you. So it's fundamentally a practice of non-separation, which at one and the same time brings self-connection and connection to other. So I am not confident personally that connection to self without at the same time being grounded in interdependence, in connectivity with others, in solidarity, in continuity, in oneness, is actually going to be a good enough basis for moving towards solidarity in action.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know to say that it isn't. I'm just very unsure.
Mm-hmm.
I generally believe that there are two paths on the spiritual journey. One I call the path of water, which is the path of calming down. It's like the image of the path of water is like a lake with no wind, where it's so clear that you can see all the way to the bottom, that purity. Yeah. And then the other path, I call it the path of fire. And the path of fire, the image of it is a biblical image. I don't know if you would be aware of it, of where Moses goes to some place and there is a bush that is burning and is not consumed. Okay. And that experience of being in the fire but not consumed by the fire is a different kind of presence than the one of calming down. For me personally, I find the path of fire much more conducive to being in the world rather than exiting from the world. I think of the existing paths that I know. The Sufi path is very much a path of fire. It's a path of passion. The practice of nonviolent communication, I also see it as a path of fire, because it is the path of allowing yourself to open and open and open to the fullness of your need, not toning it down, not taking it away, not, but allowing it to flow through you without the attachment to having to do something. That allows a certain kind of presence that I think is called for in these times that are exceedingly challenging. It's going to be exceedingly more difficult to find peace somewhere outside of what is happening. So some way to be able to stay in the fire and find our path within it is what comes to me as a response to you.
Okay. And how would for the people who believe in independence and have that inherent separation, how would they move towards the fire? Because the fear would inherently, that it's happening there.
It kind of goes back to the beginning, which is if you don't have awareness that you are living in separation and that something else is possible, you're not going to do anything different from what you're doing. So it's not just awareness that something is happening that may not work, but that something else is possible that works better. That creates the pull to move.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's what the website Coronavirus is about.
Yes.
Bringing stories. So I think storytelling is also a very interesting way to impact and bring the ripple effect more actively, more urgently to the world and to all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you talk about adopting an outlook of liberation as being really key to this whole moving into interdependence and solidarity and connection. And I'm curious how you would speak to children, or how you do speak to children and young people about these topics. And especially I'm kind of going back to what you said earlier about, when we come up with practices of abuse, we don't necessarily realize it in our families until we're adults. And so I'm just, curious about all that.
There are movies now, I'm thinking in particular about what is happening now in the United States in terms of police brutality and uprising.
Yeah.
And the difficulty, there was a video that I saw about where you see Black parents talking to their kids about this. And I didn't see one about white parents talking to their kids. There is an inherent, and this is where difference is important to notice. If you are a Black parent, you can't not talk to your children about it. You can't, because you have to protect them. If you're a white parent, you can defer it. You can say, oh, they're young. I don't want to, put something on them. I want them to maintain their innocence. But that in itself is a form of privilege. And asking yourself, what would it mean if I took so seriously the separation that happens in my country, if I am in the US, that I would choose to risk the discomfort to me and to my family to talk about this with my children, with my parents, with my brother-in-law who voted for Trump or whatever, so that the invisible web that supports the status quo begins to be frayed. Because I can't change the larger structures, but I can change what happens in the microspaces where I am. And this is another one of those instances where I can hide behind the wall of separation, or I can walk towards the discomfort of oneness. It's not an easy route, and every parent, every adult would need to find a way. But at the same time, let us not assume that our children don't know. They may not know the specific detail of what happened, but they know that the field is frayed. They know that something is happening, and therefore not talking with them is part of kind of like cementing in place their separation, because they are then required to disown their own discomfort because they can't talk about it.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's what I'm going to leave you with for the moment, unless you have a follow-up anything.
No, I'm just really touched by that. Thank you, Miki.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So the one I came in with, I've been holding sort of the metaphor around what I conceive as collective capacity, which is so aligned to this notion of solidarity. It's not simply being aware of the other, but also beginning to tap into what we bring together collectively. So that if one person doesn't have ability or capacity, that's fine. The whole will begin to inform and be informed by that. And it's an edge that I don't even have a lot of examples for. And so the metaphor that came to me was like, our body is more than the pieces or the parts that are added to it, right? So what my heart can do and what the blood can do and what the muscles can do, they're all coordinated somehow, in some way, magical through chemistry, to actually allow this being to move in a certain way. And I was thinking of collective capacity of the human race as also moving or living. Yeah. So, but I'm maybe hoping that you can provide a framework, because when I begin to talk about it, I actually feel my mouth getting really tumbly.
I have a framework, and it comes from the work of Chilean biologist Humberto Maturana.
Yeah.
And from work that he did many years ago, along with another Chilean who is no longer on the planet, Francisco Varela. And they did some work to try to define what it means that something is alive. And they coined a term called Otto Polyesis, which basically means self-organizing. And it's interesting because once you start looking at that, you realize that there are certain things that we wouldn't ordinarily think of as alive, but have all the properties of self-organization that they have, such as certain types of water whirlpools in oceans. But I'm going to leave that aside because that's not what the question is. But what becomes very clear is that as a species, we're beginning to have the links that might make it possible for us to self-organize as a collective organism. That's never been in place before. So while I am deeply frightened and feel in my bones the sense of tragedy of what patriarchy has brought us, it isn't just calamity that it brought us. It also brought us certain possibilities. At every juncture, there's possibilities that, if they could be used to transcend patriarchy, would result in amazingly more capacity for the species as a whole. Right now, as far as I can tell, we have sufficient mechanisms to be able to accurately assess needs and resources around the world, to come together, to use the very sophisticated system of logistics that exists all over the world that most people don't know about of transport, of calculating what has to go where. Just take money out of that equation and everything can move from where it is to where it's needed with great ease, because all the infrastructure is actually in place. It's just a matter of moving it from being something that is controlled by the elite to something that is radically democratized and is coordinated, not controlled, is coordinated by groupings of people coming together to make it work. This is what the global governance project that I worked on a few years ago gives a blueprint for how this kind of coordination can happen. And anyone who wants that can go to the website, to my website, and find information about it.
Well, I guess I'll kind of go back to the nation state and its failings during big crises. And I'm thinking of course, the refugee camps in Greece and all that, like they shrink back, but what's happening in the camps, and or domestic violence and all that. And but also I want to touch on what you just said about the self-organizing capacity. And what do you already see that is working, maybe, that is happening, and how can be amplified?
I'm really loving that this is coming right at the end. And you may or may not know that your country, not you, I'm not connecting you with your country, but your country is encroaching on the place in the world where the most exciting experiment in self-organizing is currently unfolding. And that is in Rojava. And it's no accident that it's happening in Syria, because Syria is a failed state. Being a failed state, it has less capacity to control. And if there is less capacity to control, there are more voids, there are more holes, windows of possibility that can be taken up by people from below. The previous one that I know of happened during the Spanish Civil War under similar conditions. There was a failed state and people self-organized. It happens. This is just, as far as I know, the longest one in a very long time. It's already going on for 9 years. And it's completely bottom up. I think it's the most exciting thing that is happening on the planet right now. And I have a great desire to go visit. But key to it is that it starts in neighborhoods and comes together for coordination. And second key, I don't want to lose sight of it, is it's the first place in the world that I know of on a large scale that calls itself feminist. Meaning there is a deep recognition, part conscious, part unconscious, that patriarchy, the patriarchal turn, is the root of what got us here. And feminism is the undoing of that. And ideally, integrating all the benefits that we got from it so that we can have a post-patriarchal time rather than thinking that we go back to anything. We can't go back. We can only go forward, and we can integrate. Thank you. Thanks for that last question. All right.
Would you like to say a few words about what you mean by feminism, just at the differentiation with patriarchy?
Yeah. So feminism for me is not about being against men. Feminism is about transcending, putting down women and everything associated with women in life and making that central, not that women come to rule, but that the principle of mothering, which is a principle that is other-oriented, that is precisely about attending to needs, becomes the organizing principle of everything that comes. Thanks for asking that.
Thank you.